playing wargames as much as I do tends to end up with you owning a whole bunch of model kits. And as is tradition, I have fallen behind on painting those kits, so I thought I'd try something interesting. We mini painters know the ins and outs of batch painting infantry, but is it possible to batch paint vehicles? Now, I have a whole week, which isn't true. I actually have a couple of hours a day over the course of a week, but I have a week sort of. It's like one of those silly YouTube painting an army in 24 hours, except I don't have that kind of time because I'm not a proper YouTuber. Well, I'm going to give it a go and do my best and see how much I can get done in this time. And I mentioned I'm going to be painting some vehicles, and these are my German vehicles that I haven't painted. As you can see, I've done bits and pieces to these over the last few months. Some of them have got to the point of being base coated, some aren't even primed, and there's a couple that do need a little modelling work before I even get to priming those. At the front is a Revell 1-48 motorcycle, a 3D printed Kettenkrad. Some Italeri kits are 251 Stummel, Panzer III, Hetzer and Tiger. And this last one, the big old mouse, is a collection of low quality 3D prints badly glued together. I'll get back to that. If you want to see the modelling work on most of these vehicles, I do have separate videos on some of them. But I don't intend to make a separate video on the mouse just because it's been a whole heap of work. Although, while it is a poor implementation of the idea, it was a good idea. Essentially, the peachy fleshy coloured parts are FDM prints, and that's to block out the basic shape with a plastic printer, which is quicker, stronger, but lower detail than resin. And then the grey panels are SLA prints to bring along the surface detail. Unfortunately, this is from my old SLA printer, and neither that or my FDM machine are anything like good quality. Whilst I've managed to assemble this model kit and fix up most of the worst parts, the tracks are an ongoing disaster. I don't really know any way of improving things without completely reprinting the entire track assembly, which I don't want to do at this point. And so, the easy trick for bad tracks, the old-time, tried and tested modeller's technique for bad tracks, mud. I'm going to cake the whole lot in superglue and baking powder, and this will make a very rough texture, coat all of the detail and the imperfections along with it, and I can paint that all as mud at the end after everything else is painting up. And as a bonus, it's actually going to be quite strong. Superglue and baking powder holds quite tightly, and so those pieces of track that aren't necessarily glued together very well shouldn't break. I showed that some of the models have already got a little bit of paint on them. The Panzer III and the motorcycle just have a flat base coat, and the 251 has sort of got a little bit of effort in modulation, but it's not what I would usually do because I went from light to dark. For the other vehicles, I want to use the technique that I've developed since then, and for that I usually start with a dark base coat and work lighter. For the Tiger, my base coat here is going to be my darkest paint, which is going to be a charcoal black with a little bit of a light blue grey and just a hint of a very beautiful gloss ultramarine blue to give it some richness in the darkest points of the model. I then mixed quite a lot more of the blue-grey into it to get a lighter mix and hit each of the armour panel sections and hatches of the vehicle to give the effect that I like. The Jagdpanzer got the same treatment, with the base coat being a little bit lighter than the Tiger, without that dark blue, but then also the highlight colour was mixed a little bit lighter than the equivalent highlight colour for the Tiger. But as the armour panels of the Hetzer is fairly plain, I gave them a couple of stripes, and I was going to kind of planning to turn that into some camouflage later on. As I was going back and forth between these shades of essentially the same two paints, I base coated and then modulated all of the other vehicles as well. The mouse got a much lighter tone, but still that black mixed with the blue-grey means that it's a very desaturated colour. Oh, and the Kettenkrad is here too, a little too small for modulation, so it got more of a zenithal highlight in this case. By the time I finished all of that, which I've now managed to get all of my vehicles to nearly the same status, I had used up my first 2 days, and I've still got quite a lot of work to go. Day 3 started with some stippling. I usually like to add quite a lot of weathering in stipple form and other techniques, but to save myself what would quite literally be a couple of days work, I'm going to have to stipple only where I really need to for the main colours of each vehicle and leave the weathering to the absolute minimum. On the Hetzer, I emphasised the lighter camo stripes with the stippling of the blue-grey, unmixed, which is a pretty bright paint to use in those spots. To offset those, I stippled on some black, the same charcoal black again, and this is an unmixed paint, and so that became the darkest points on the model. And yes, I know, this is not a historical paint scheme. I refer you to the photograph of a German tank crew painting camo on their tank with a mop. I did go around dry brushing a little bit over the Tiger's Zimmeret, but then also around the upper turret to give some tiny impressions of weathering, but like I said, I'm trying to keep that to a minimum to save time. I just have enough time for the decals on day 3, and in this shot you can see just how poor the FDM prints are on the mouse. Oof. Almost like the transfers are worth more than the model they're going on to. As a little joke, I put the number 3 onto the mouse to indicate that this is not a historical simulation model, but rather an alternate history where production of these just absurd tanks got to at least the 3rd. On all of the others, I made sure that the Balkan Cruise was present on most of them, but I really wasn't spending a lot of time checking historical photographs for each vehicle to work out where every single unit marking would be. I can of course come back and add them in if I want to later on, but my limited times means I have to concentrate on the minimum emphasis to sell the effect overall. Day the 4th of some real paintbrushing at last. When I built up the Rubicon Kettenkrad a little while ago, I decided to try mixing brown, silver and black to make my tracks colour. And that worked really nicely. And so for this week, I'm going to make a whole run of tracked vehicles. I'm going to make up a whole batch of this same mix. And I was very strict about the ratio of paint because I used about this much of each paint, and that suited me just fine. So even though I'm trying to save time and put the minimum effort in at each step, I accidentally painted the mouse tracks with this silver-brown mix. And eventually when I get to painting the mud at the end, none of that's going to be visible, so this is kind of a bit of a waste. As I came to the end of my batch of mixed paint, I added some more silver to it, making it mainly silver. And that was used on every other metallic component of the various vehicles. Machine guns, tools, exhausts, and I wasn't necessarily too specific about these, as I was happy to miss some bits or to paint some parts that might not supposed to be silver, if it made the balance of paint around each model more even. As I have 4 paints on the wet palette now, why not use that brown on anything that makes sense being brown? The leather and wood of the seats, the tool handles, and anything else. By this point, the end of day 4, the basics of each vehicle are really nicely coming together. Most of them have some modulation, some details are painted, all the really basic stuff is out of the way, but there's still a ways to go with all of them. But I'm running short on time, and so I have to finish off the techniques that have the biggest effects and drop anything that's more subtle, even though those are the ones that really makes the vehicles look the best. And there's a little bit of a kerfuffle brewing, because my secret alternate turret for the Panzer III, which I actually dropped at some point, so it's shattered, I forgot that I had printed this Whirlwind turret, and yes, I know it's the wrong one. It should be a single-barreled 3.7cm, not the quad 2cm, because that would be a Panzer IV Whirlwind, Flak Panzer IV. But aside from the historical inaccuracies, I should start day 5, and yes, I'm already at day 5. I did say I only had a short time each day. I could start day 5 with fixing up the details on the Whirlwind turret, which actually wasn't that much. It's just the metallics and the black on the appropriate parts of the inside. And then I got started with a wash, and in fact, given that I'm doing so many vehicles all at once, I mixed up a whole big batch of my usual ink glaze wash. And because I'm probably going to use all of it straight away, I used the lid of my wet palette as a pot for that. Generally speaking, it's equal parts water, black ink, and matte medium. with just a little bit of surfactant in the form of washing up liquid. Because I make it myself, I can vary each component to change how it behaves. If it's too dark, add water. If it's too light, add ink. If it's running too much, like it does on the Panzer III hull, you add more matte medium to make it stickier, and the surfactant makes it pull into the recesses more. I also usually just about get it to the right balance where it doesn't coffee stain too badly. Although on the mouse it kind of did anyway. It does, however, take a fair time to dry and cure, so I tend to leave it overnight so that I don't rip up the wash while adding later paint steps. And so the rest of my day 5 was actually spent assembling some Perry miniatures models for a different video. Day 6, and what can I say? Again, not much time, but what can I achieve in that time? My favourite part of painting vehicles, that's what I can achieve in the time today. My good old edge highlighting, which I really wanted to include properly, so I spent all of my day 6 doing just this one step. And I was going back and forth between the various vehicles to make sure that I got at least some definition on everything first before I went back and kind of emphasized the bits that I wanted to be stronger. I think I say this in every video where I paint armor, but I really like edge highlighting after doing messy techniques like washes or stippling. It keeps the natural variation from the messy techniques, but it gives it structure, it frames it, it emphasizes each shape, each armor panel, each hatch and so on, so that from a gaming distance, you can clearly see all of the details. Now, I do have to hold myself back, as I'll end up with tanks that look like they fell out of a Cyberpunk B movie. Ooh, I should paint a Cyberpunk tank, yes. I need to... Right, that's another video coming soon. To make sure I don't end up with a semi-realistic looking tank in a cyberpunk glowy paint scheme, I do have to hold myself back and be more subtle in quite a few areas. A lot of the edges got a thinner line, a lot of the edges got a spotty line, and only the most important shapes got stronger solid lines. But alas, I did today run out of time, and so it's not quite perfect over every single vehicle. But what that does mean is that all of these vehicles are basically in tabletop acceptable form. And I will use my last day to add just a few tiny bits, and those tiny bits are the crew models. Whilst a lot of these vehicles do come with tank commanders or crew figures, I only actually have a couple of open hatches, and I don't have crew models for all of the open top vehicles. The thing that's great about crew figures for tanks is that you get to use different colours all of a sudden and have this nice pop of something that looks more interesting than the solid block of colour that the rest of the tank becomes. In my case, all of these vehicles so far have been painted with 5 paints. And most of the surface of all of them, the armour, is just 2 paints, the black and the blue-grey. The others are the brown and silver, the various details and tracks, and then the black ink in the wash. These crew figures add in a Caucasian and a green. Wow, such variety, such amazing painting quality. Wow, such lies, wow. But yeah, that's it. Well, my time is up. My time has run out completely. My whole week of hobby time is done. But I did manage to paint up my collection of German vehicles, and they are... well, they're fine. At a minimum, they are quite well and truly enough for wargaming, but they're certainly not display quality level paint jobs. Given the time I had, I wouldn't expect a display level paint job on even just one vehicle, so the fact I managed to do 7 is quite satisfying actually. Strangely, I feel that the mouse, which is certainly the worst model underneath the paint, isn't the worst overall. Rather, it sits in the middle of the pack. The worst, in my opinion, is the motorbike, which is actually one of the better model kits, very nicely detailed model, but that quality of the model just doesn't look good with the minimal painting effort that I've put onto it. I could come back and concentrate on just this one kit at a time to bring out those details more neatly, but that'll have to wait for another day. The Panzer III isn't much better, and I feel like the lack of modulation on this one really hurts it. Plus, the wash is messier than on any of the others, and I'm not sure why. For this, I feel I could come back with some relatively easy, although they would be time-consuming techniques, and I could really neaten this up without a lot of effort. The Kettenkrad, well, that's just a 3D print I threw in on a spare print bed, so I'm not really worried that it's not terribly good looking. And I feel the 251 comes next, because it does look fairly good, but there are quite a few blemishes on it. The overall tone, the kind of grimy, dirty look of a well-used vehicle is kind of on point, but there are messy patches in the wash and overbrushes for the edge highlight. This one could do with a little bit more weathering, which could very easily hide all of those blemishes and finish it off quite nicely. The mouse, this big silly brick of a wargaming model, comes next. It's big, obnoxious, and has been a hell of a job to build from all of those separate bad prints. But it's together, and good grief, I'm glad that it's done, and it actually does look fairly good. You'll notice that for the mouse I've painted on the mud, which I didn't record. The lower edge of the hull collected the wash rather poorly, but because that's now partially hidden under the dirt, which adds to a variety of tones, the whole thing just looks much more varied and interesting. Between the modulation, the wash, the mud, this big, flat and completely void of detail hull side actually looks surprisingly good. It's not the best model ever, but I'm just surprised that it looks as good as it does, given what it looked like before it was painted. And this is the first model in the set that I have no intention of coming back to tidy up. You can only polish a turd so far. Next up is the Tiger with the darkest armour, as I started from that black. The blue I added is very subtle, to the point where I'm not actually sure if it's having any effect at all, but my usual techniques all come together nicely for this one. And finally, my favourite vehicle of the whole lot, which is actually also my favourite model kit, and it's also probably the one vehicle that suits my game style the best and so will get the most use, is the Hetzer. All of the paintwork here is the tidiest of all the models in this video, and the camo stripes look pretty cool, fairly subtle. I like it. I guess being neat has its benefits. The wash has no gaps, the modulation is just right, and the edge highlight, maybe not perfect, but is certainly the cleanest in comparison to all of the others in this video. And wouldn't you know it, that's my week complete. I don't have any more time to clean up anything right now, but maybe if I get time sometime in the future, I can come back to a few of them. They are all perfectly suitable for wargaming, just that some might sit further back on the shelf than others in between games. Which is your favourite of the models I've shown today? Post a comment below, not for the sake of the algorithm, but just because I like having people to talk to about this hobby. Really, what I feel like I have achieved here is I've proved that whilst it does take some time to paint a miniature, especially a miniature vehicle, you can use some fairly simple techniques for half an hour or an hour each day over several days to get them completed before too long. My week has been exceptionally busy, and it was important for me to have some relaxing time to myself, and painting these tanks really hit the spot. So I can now put them aside and move on to some other models for next week. But for this video, that's all I have to cover. I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.